need to know about Phase 2 HIPAA audit webinar. I'm Beth Kolodny, the National Sales Manager for ComplyTrack. Before we begin today's webinar and introduce our featured speakers, I just want to cover a few quick housekeeping items. For any questions, please use the menu bar located on the right side of your screen. Today's handouts are available on the GoToWebinars toolbar under the Handouts tab. Also, there was a link to them on the reminder email that was sent just about an hour ago. All lines have been placed on mute. And now, to introduce today's speakers. Adam Green is a partner with Davis Wright Tremaine. Adam is a nationally recognized authority on HIPAA and the HITECH Act, primarily counsels healthcare systems, technology companies, and financial institutions in compliance with the HIPAA privacy, security, and breach notification requirements. Adam is a former regulator at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, where he played a key role in administering and enforcing the HIPAA rules. At HHS, Adam is responsible for determining how HIPAA rules apply to new and emerging health information technologies, and he was instrumental in the development of the current enforcement process. HealthcareInfoSecurity.com recently named Adam one of 2015's top 10 influencers in the nation in health information security. Cliff Baker is the managing partner of Methodology Services. Cliff is an industry leader in healthcare information technology, privacy, and security, and has over 17 years of industry experience. He has worked with the nation's leading healthcare organizations across all sectors of the industry and has served as an executive advisor for key information affiliations and companies. He is a sought-after contributor and speaker for various health, IT, and information risk management forums, the lead author of the HITRUST Common Security Framework, and author of various IT risk management publications. Prior to forming Methodology, Cliff was the Chief Strategy Officer for HITRUST and also led PricewaterhouseCoopers Healthcare Security Practice. I'd also like to introduce Lynn Reinheimer, who is the Manager of ComplyTrack Subject Matter Editors and Sales Engineers. Adam?
Thank you. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone, whichever the case may be. So thank you for having me here today to talk about the OCR audits, Phase 2. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of background on the OCR audits. Really, the genesis of this Phase 2 audit program is the 2009 HITECH Act, which required OCR to conduct periodic audits of covered entities and business associates. Really, prior to 2009, enforcement with respect to the privacy and security rules were really entirely reactive with respect to complaints coming in to the Office for Civil Rights, or CMS, which handled the security rule at the time, or potentially the government taking action with respect to media reports. And so the Office of the Inspector General noted in particular in a couple of reports on CMS's then oversight of the security rule that there really should be more proactive review, and suggested a more proactive auditing program. So that was largely, I expect, the genesis of Congress specifically requiring an audit program going forward. So OCR began that audit program really towards the end of 2011, after they had a contractor look at certain different audit options. And so 2011 through 2012 was essentially the Phase 1 audits, which I'll talk more about in slides to come. And then in 2013, OCR had another contractor complete an evaluation of the audit program to look at whether there are ways that they could improve it going forward. And 2014, spring of 2014, we started getting an outline of the Phase 2 audit program. So that's when we first started getting the real substantive details of what this upcoming audit program would look like. And then fall of 2014, the Phase 2 audit program was originally scheduled to begin, but as we'll talk about, there has certainly been some delays, and so we're still waiting for it to really kick off at this point. So let's talk about kind of the phase 1 audits and some of the key findings that they found. So first, they found widespread issues. So OCR found that only 11% of the audited entities did not have some adverse findings with respect to compliance. So, in other words, 89% had one or more adverse findings, and many of them had a significant number. Of the ones that did not have any problems, only 2 of these entities were providers. In general, as you'll see in a trend, health plans, for example, tended to do better than healthcare providers. So one of the next key findings was security compliance being a challenge. Covered entities struggled the most with security rule compliance. Of note, there were more essentially questions or audit areas with respect to the privacy rule. And so one would expect more privacy rule findings if all things were equal, but what OCR discovered was that all things were not equal, and that security rule, despite being a lesser number of areas in the audit, represented a larger number of the adverse findings. So another key finding was that healthcare providers definitely had higher struggles than others. So disproportionately, healthcare providers had a disproportionately larger number of adverse findings than health plans or healthcare clearinghouses. As I'll note again later on, business associates were not included in this first phase audit. It was just covered entities. And then, probably not coming as a big surprise to members of the audience, small organizations were found to have more problems than larger organizations. Small organizations, while representing about 25% of the sample, had significantly higher percent of the adverse findings. So some more specific results of the phase 1 audits. So, I'm sorry, I just lost that. So on the privacy rule side, we had notice of privacy practices was a big area, so about 20% on notice of privacy practices. You'll see the biggest, 44%, was uses and disclosures of PHI, and of course that covers a whole lot of territory. And it's somewhat interesting that that's not a focus of the phase 2 audits initially, despite what we see here as that being the largest number of adverse findings. So at 16%, access of individuals to PHI was a big issue. And at 18%, various administrative requirements. That could be a lack of policies or procedures, or a lack of a designated privacy officer, or lack of training. All of that potentially falls under this 18%. So while uses and disclosures and administrative requirements represent pretty large volumes here, both of those cover a lot of territory. So if you're looking at really detailed issues, we do see that notice of privacy practices and individuals' right of access really do stand out as problem areas with these phase 1 audits. So on the uses and disclosures, we had a number of different issues. Business associates was a big area here at 18%. I'm not familiar with particular details of what business associate issues were found, but I imagine a lack of business associate agreements may certainly be a part of that. Lack of identity verification was at 8%. Minimum necessary, so that could be failing to have policies in place, failing to implement minimum necessary was at 17%. And then we had authorization issues, deceased individuals, personal representatives were up next, and then judicial administrative procedures like responding to a subpoena and group health plan requirements rounding things out. So in the security rule findings, we've got a number of things somewhat spread out. We've got risk analysis at 12%, access management at 14%, security incident procedures, so for example, recognizing a security incident and putting in place a security incident report, 7%, contingency planning and backup was one of the biggest issues at 18%. Workstation security, media movement and destruction was 14%. Encryption 8%, audit controls and monitoring was 14%, and then integrity controls. And so we don't have anything jumping out quite as much other than arguably contingency planning and backup being a big issue. But anyone who's heard OCR speak within the past 3 years also knows that risk analysis is an area that they are really focused on. So let's talk a bit about phase 1 versus phase 2 audits, because if you're really looking to prepare for a phase 1 audit, you're kind of missing the boat. The phase 2 audits are going to look very different, at least the initial desk audits. So phase 1 audits were on-site comprehensive audits. So you had people, in this case, as indicated by the next bullet, contractors of OCR, coming on site for a number of days, which could vary based on the size of the entity, and really looking at everything. So if you were subject to a phase 1 audit, your privacy rule compliance, your security rule compliance, and your breach notification compliance were all being reviewed. And while there was initially a contract with the contractor that conducted the audits to do 150, that got winnowed down to 115 entities in phase 1. And phase 1 was covered entities only, despite the congressional mandate to review both covered entities and business associates. Now, one of the challenges that was faced was that prior to phase 1, there was not some master list that OCR had at its disposal of all covered entities out there. So part of phase 1 was actually even putting together that list of covered entities. And similarly, there's no master list of business associates out there. So we'll come back to part of phase 2 being putting together a list of business associates. So in contrast, phase 2 is at least initially going to be primarily desk audits. And these desk audits are going to be focused. So these will the phase 2 program is staffed by OCR. We have not heard any word that they will be using contractors to staff it. And originally they were looking at 400 desk audits. And the breakdown there was that you would have, I believe it was 150 desk audits that were specifically focused on just security rule compliance, and then 100 that was specifically focused on privacy rule compliance, and 50 that was specifically focused on breach. And so if you receive a desk audit, it is not going to look at privacy, security, and breach, but rather just one of those 3 areas. Now, what they indicated was that they also were interested in doing on-site comprehensive audits as resources allow. And this is really the biggest question mark we have for the phase 2 audit program, what exactly that means, because we've heard slightly different stories at time during different OCR presentations as to whether or not they do anticipate doing on-site comprehensive audits. What I had heard last fall was that they were potentially looking at lowering the number of desk audits from 400. And by the way, the numbers I gave you before added up to 350 because there'd be another 50 for business associates. So they looked at moving that from 400 to potentially 200. And we don't know if the breakdown would potentially follow the same with respect to which ones are security versus privacy versus breach. And there was an indication that that was because they potentially were going to put some of those resources towards on-site comprehensive audits. And so we don't have exact numbers. We don't know whether it's going to be 400 desk audits or 200, where things currently stand, and we don't know really much of anything about the on-site comprehensive audits, but we'll still talk about how to potentially prepare for those as best we can. So as I alluded to earlier, phase 2 audits will include both covered entities and business associates. So the process for phase 2 desk audits, as at least it was talked about in spring of 2014, was that OCR was going to first begin with confirming address information for between 550 to 800 entities. And with the lowered numbers in the fall, we don't know if they're still looking at that range or if that could be a smaller range. But this is just the simple task of contacting the a covered entity, and we'll come back to business associates later, and just confirming that they have the right address information for who is going to be contacted. And that may include an email address, because there's been talk that after they confirm address information, including email, that you would actually receive an email with the showing that you've been selected for audit, which in this age of phishing exercises, you do have to be careful about strange emails coming from the government, but you presumably should have received a address confirmation contact from OCR first before ever receiving that sort of email. If not, you certainly can be suspicious of that. So then OCR is going to send out a survey. That survey is going to collect some more detailed demographic information. And we've included a link. We've provided a tiny URL link that will take you to at least the survey that was approved by the Office of Management and Budget, and is likely to be the survey that we will see. And that includes the kind of demographic information that they need to collect in order to then audit a fairly diverse population. So they want to know what's your size, what sort of services you provide, so that they could have that sort of diversity when they begin the auditing. And then we're talking about OCR auditing 350 covered entities, but that may be now significantly less based on what they had said in the fall. It may be more like 150, for example, and then about 50 business associates. At some point in the process, I thought it would be the survey process, but it looks like it's probably going to be when they actually start auditing covered entities. They will ask each audited covered entity for a list of business associates. And that is how they're going to put together a list of business associates from which they will select the business associates that will then be audited. So you're not going to see, in all likelihood, business associates audited at the same time as covered entities, but rather afterwards, because OCR needs to collect that information. So where are we on the process? There has been some confusion on this point. There was some articles suggesting that surveys had gone out, but actually what had happened was, based on my understanding from discussions with OCR, is that really it was just the address confirmation, which had been going on since last year in the fall, and it picked up again, and that OCR, as to the best of my knowledge, has not yet actually sent out the surveys, and has indicated that they'll indicate when they do so. So what to expect for covered entities? The focus, which was originally supposed to be 2014, but I've crossed that out because now it's probably later this year or possibly even next year. We'll start off with risk analysis and risk management if you are chosen for a security rule desk audit. Content and timeliness of breach notifications if you're chosen for a breach audit. Notice of privacy practices and individuals' right of access if you are chosen for a privacy audit. And then the next focus, originally scheduled for 2015, but now it could be 2016 or even later, device and media controls and transmission security, and privacy safeguards, and training to policies and procedures. And then what was originally projected for 2016, and at this point, who knows when, encryption and decryption would come later, facility access controls, so essentially physical security, as these were high-risk areas identified in the original audits. I'm sorry, also other high-risk areas that might be identified in the beginning audits, and breach reports and complaints. So this is the desk audits. For the on-site comprehensive audits, to the extent that those do occur, everything is on the table. So what to expect for business associates? Covered entities will be asked to identify all business associates just at some point. It looks like it wouldn't be the survey. So if you're a covered entity, now's the time to look at your vendor management process and be prepared to identify all your business associates. And then the business associate audits, they're going to try to do mostly IT-based business associates. In the original numbers, it would be 35 out of 50 would be IT-based, but others would be also included. And all business associates would potentially be risk analysis and risk management and breach reporting. So they're not looking at privacy in the beginning at business associates, but rather focusing on risk analysis and management and breach reporting to covered entities. So let me turn it over to Cliff to talk about some common issues and strategies.
Great, thanks, Adam. I'm going to, halfway through this list, I'm going to turn it back to Adam for a couple of these bullet points as well. So I'm going to walk you through some points that, based on our experience, one, doing mock audits for covered entities and business associates, and also actually helping organizations respond to both OCR investigations and audits. Based on that experience, some of the lessons we've learned and some of the trends and challenges that we've experienced, and hopefully share with you some insights and some strategies to make your lives easier as you go through these audits. They don't have to be overwhelming, they don't have to be painful, but they do require you to be prepared and organized, and I'm going to walk you through some of those strategies. Adam, can you move to the next slide, please? So just overall, with respect to audit preparedness, as I mentioned, it's important for you to have an organized approach to an audit, especially the OCR audit. From our point of view, it's important to treat it like a project, like a mini project, and to have a point of contact established to kind of oversee the project. The reason being is, based on our experience, what we've seen is organizations have a very kind of reactive and panicky response to these audits, and the net result is that documents come in from all over the organization. Security gathers some, privacy gathers some, compliance gathers some, IT gathers some, and all these documents come in, and there's no real kind of filtering, there's no real kind of review. They're all kind of added to zip files, to folders, and sent over to the auditor. And unfortunately, whatever you send to the auditor, it is now incumbent upon the auditor to review and assess. And all too often, the documents that we've seen from mock audits or in actually preparing responses to OCR inquiries, there are documents there that contradict each other, there are documents there that are outdated, there are documents there that no longer apply to an organization or only apply to a subsidiary of the organization. And once the cat is out the bag, so to speak, it's too late really to pull those documents back. So for us, it's really important to, again, treat this like a project, have a point of contact. That point of contact is the only person that interacts with the auditors, unless obviously the auditors want to interview folks, then you've got to make other people available, but you do that through the single point of contact. And then you have an organized way to get your documents, to file your documents, to review your documents, and approve them to be sent to the auditors. Adam, can you move the slides on, please? Thank you. So with respect to documentation, the kind of initial request will be around policy and procedure documents, and then often there'll be a follow-up around evidence to support that you actually have implemented or executing the policies and procedures that you have documented. So these are some common challenges that we see when it comes to the policies that are provided over to auditors. One, often policies are not formalized, so organizations, again, are scrambling, and they'll take policies. We found organizations will take policies from wherever they can find them, and often it's from a business unit. One business unit has created a policy, so we stick it in the list. And or we've acquired a new company, and they did a pretty decent job at a certain procedure, put it in the list. And so organizations pull together documents any which way they can, and then they send that over to the auditors, and the natural questions you're going to get back are, why do these policies look different? Why do they have a different governance structure? Why do they have a different sign-off structure? Why are the dates on these documents so outdated? When were they last reviewed? When were they last updated? And so essentially the scramble kind of creates unnecessary issues, unnecessary problems for the organization. One of the big messages I'm going to try to get across to you in this presentation is more information is not necessarily beneficial to you. And I've heard OCR say this often. If you send us a document, speaking for OCR, we have a duty to look through it, and we have a duty to assess it, and then we have a duty to follow up. So please just send us what we're asking for, and don't try and impress us or overwhelm us, so to speak, with documentation, because it's usually, unfortunately, only going to come back to create more of an issue for you. So strategies, it's important to make sure that you have an overall governance for your policies. In other words, you have a process for how policies are established. You have a governance process for who approves those policies. And tactically, and it's important, this is an important point, and tactically you have a process for who signs off, where they sign off, and where you maintain and keep revisions to those documents. Because you'll be asked when was the last time you reviewed the policy, and you'll be asked when was the last time you updated it, and certainly, where some policies relate to regulations that have been updated, let's say, for example, since the HIPAA rules are updated, it's going to be important for you to be able to demonstrate that you've updated your policies accordingly. And then, make sure in your policies that you don't refer to procedures or processes that you can't meet. And that's another key issue that I just want to stress. Often we'll see policies where the organization says we'll encrypt all portable media, and the organization has no strategy for how to do that. And now, not only do you have to defend why you have not implemented that safeguard, but you've acknowledged that it's an important safeguard. You've acknowledged that you think encrypting is the right thing to do because it's in your policies, and you're complying with your own policies. So it's important to pay attention to what your policies say and what they call out for. And when they refer to lists, like we'll see references to asset lists or lists for all mobile devices in the organization. We'll see references to forms. This form will be used to document incidents. This form will be used for password resets, etc. What the kind of response you'll get from the auditor is, I see this form is attached to this procedure or to this policy. Please give me completed forms for the last 3 months. And then often, we've had the experience where clients come back and go, oh, actually, it's just an example, it's just a reference. We don't really use that form. And so, that's kind of a common occurrence that we've experienced with policy and procedure documentation. Adam, I think I'm going to turn it back over to you for the next 2 slides.
Thank you, Cliff. So we've been given a bit of an open book test here, which is nice. They've told us with respect to at least the desk audits, what their initial focus is going to be. And one of them is the individual's right of access. If you recall, this was a very significant area of findings in the phase 1 audits. So some of the challenges that we see here, policies are not necessarily updated on the right of access. So the omnibus rule, for example, included a couple of changes there. So on the strategy side, ensure that your policy addresses access to electronic records. The omnibus rule essentially tweaks things so that if you maintain information electronically in a designated record set, like medical records or billing records, and someone asks for an electronic copy, they are entitled to receive an electronic copy, either in the form that they request, but if they request, for example, Microsoft Word version 1.2, and that's not readily producible, they're entitled to a default of electronic, like a PDF, for example. And so you want to make sure that your access policy has been updated accordingly, and also that it includes the right for the individual to designate a third-party recipient. So this is sometimes an area of confusion. If the request comes from a third party, then it's subject to an authorization requirement. But in contrast, if the patient or health plan member makes the request and they ask that it be sent to a third party, that is treated as an individual's request and should be subject to, for example, the fee limitations and the timing requirements there. So you want to make sure that your access policy is updated. And of course, ensure that you have an access policy first and foremost. So another challenge is that policies do not necessarily address denial of access. This is, I think, an area that they saw problems on. And so as a strategy, ensure that you've got policies and processes in place to address denial of access. So for example, addressing if a healthcare professional believes that there could be substantial physical harm by providing access. And then there's an individual's appeal right. And this is where things really sometimes fall through, because an individual, when you deny, you have to make sure that you provide in the denial letter that the individual has a right to appeal that. So another challenge is insufficient documentation of access requests and responses. So yes, you may have policies in place, but they may ask in the desk audit, provide us with all of your access requests and your responses. Is that readily available? Or on the other hand, is that buried in medical records and you don't know where to even look to find them? So you want to think about whether that sort of documentation is readily available. So next area is notice of privacy practices. So some of the challenges there, the notice may not be updated per the omnibus rule. So the strategy, obviously confirm that the notice was updated per the omnibus rule. Not huge updates required. We're talking fairly minor things like calling out sale of PHI, marketing of that sale of PHI requires an authorization, that marketing requires an authorization, adding information about breach notification obligations. And if you want, you can actually just drop your current notice of privacy practices and use the model notice that HHS has put out. It's a pretty good model notice that you'll have to make some minor, you'll have to put your name in and make some minor changes to, but it's something that you can consider. Another challenge, acknowledgement of receipt of notice is not maintained, or maybe not even collected. This is the process that when a healthcare provider with a direct treatment relationship sees a patient for the first time, they should provide that patient with a notice of privacy practices, and they should get a signature or some sort of acknowledgement of receipt of that notice. Now, the person's not agreeing to anything. It's not a consent, as some people sometimes misunderstand. It's just an acknowledgement that they've received it. There may be circumstances where you cannot get that acknowledgement, in which case you want to have documentation that you made a good faith effort to do so. So on the strategy side, make sure that you're able to produce records of acknowledgement of receipt of notice if that's requested, because there's a good chance that that will be part of any desk audit on this area. Another challenge is notice is not properly posted at the facility in, for example, a waiting area or on the website. So, of course, you want to document that your notice is properly posted. Maintain documentation of your website to show that it's on the website, that it's posted there. Double check. You want to find out if that's a dead link rather than having an auditor find that out. And maybe even take a picture of your posting in the facility and plan to be able to provide that. So the next area is breach notification. Some challenges here. Insufficient or outdated breach notification policy. If your policy, for example, is based on the interim final rule and talks about whether there's a significant risk of financial, reputational, or other harm, you're a bit late to the game, but now's a very good time to update that breach notification policy to reflect, one, that there's this clear presumption in the omnibus rule that any impermissible use or disclosure is a reportable breach, and then you can only rebut that presumption by demonstrating a low probability of compromise, considering at least 4 factors. So make sure that your policy is up to date on that front. Another challenge is insufficient documentation of a breach risk assessment or breach notifications. So you want to really make sure that anytime there's an impermissible use or disclosure in your organization, you can produce either the 2, possibly 3 required breach notifications, one being notification to HHS. They should likely know that since they are HHS, but it never hurts to maintain a copy of what was sent. The second one being the notification to the individuals, at least having a sample notification for particular incident that you could provide. The third one being media. If it's over 500 people in a particular state or jurisdiction, you want to make sure you've got a copy of that media notification. And actually, there's a bit of a fourth one, too, that's sometimes forgotten, which is substitute notice. Do you have documentation of substitute notice for any incidents? Alternatively, you may have just determined a low probability of compromise, so you want to be able to have that breach risk assessment to document that. If OCR comes knocking and asks for this information and you say we have not had any impermissible use or disclosure within the past year, that may be met with a little bit of skepticism, be warned. So now let me turn it back to Cliff.
Thanks, Adam. Appreciate it. So a couple of other challenges and strategies we have here, and then I'm going to pass it on to Lynn and then open it up for questions. So one of the key areas, and Adam stressed this before, this is clearly a focus area for OCR and comes up time and time again, is the risk assessment and your risk and your related risk management program. So some challenges that we've seen, and Adam and I have experienced this together working on some clients together, is organizations confuse a gap analysis with a risk assessment as is required under the HIPAA rule. Now, where this is a potentially significant problem for you is that a gap analysis essentially lines up the HIPAA rule, reg by reg, and security rule, and then assesses the organization's controls against the HIPAA rule. Unfortunately, that's not what the risk assessment requirement is about. The risk assessment requirement is about assessing the likelihood of threats exploiting vulnerabilities in the organization, and if that should occur, what will be the impact to the organization, and therefore, how are you going to mitigate the risk with controls? A lot of technical jargon there, but what I'm trying to stress is that there's an important distinction between the risk assessment and the gap analysis, and the problem with many organizations that use a gap analysis as a substitute for a risk assessment is it really is a document historical record of where you're not complying with the HIPAA security rule. And when you turn over that to an auditor, you're essentially saying, here is documented evidence of where we are time and time again not complying with the security rule, because hopefully you've been doing risk assessments on an ongoing basis. And so I caution you, if you open up your risk assessment and it starts with the HIPAA rule on one side and a rating of some sort on the other side, it's probably time to kind of step back and rethink about how you're doing your risk assessments, and make sure you do your risk assessments more in accordance to the NIST standard out there called NIST 830, government published standard for doing a risk assessment. It's a good reference source for how to go about doing that risk assessment. Another issue we're finding with respect to the risk assessments is there's no clear transition. So OCR expects that you're doing continuous risk assessments. They tell you that you need to do continuous risk assessments. There's not real clarity around frequency. I've heard from OCR maybe every other year at a minimum, but what is clear is that you have to do a risk assessment when there's any substantive change around risk in your environment. So you have a new IT system or your environment changes, and for many health systems, that's almost an annual occurrence. And so it's expected that you are doing an ongoing risk assessment, and what we find is that there's no real great transition from one risk assessment to the other. So, why are risks trending up or down if you look at the risks from year to year to year? And that's a question that you're likely to get. How come this risk persists to head in the wrong direction? In other words, persistently is headed as a high-risk issue for you, and you're not doing anything to resolve it. And that comes back to my final point, which is make sure you have a remediation plan associated with at a minimum, any high risk that you've identified in your environment. It is a bad outcome for you, I think, if you have a risk assessment that shows a risk and you cannot produce documentation that shows that you recognize the risk and are taking measures to mitigate that risk. So we will talk about a corrective action plan. That's just a technical term for a document that says, I see the risk, I acknowledge the risk, and this is what we're going to do about it. This is what we're going to do about it is obviously going to make some investments, put some controls in place to change that risk over time. It's critical that you have that strategy, because one question you're going to be asked is why? Why have you ignored this? And hopefully it doesn't demonstrate willful neglect. by simply ignoring this risk and presenting any failure to address it over time. Adam, can you move on, please? Adam, can you move the slides one more?
Are you not?
Okay.
Do you want business associates now?
No, sorry, access control. Sorry, it was a little bit slow coming up. There we go. There we go. It's right now. It looks like it's on the screen. Thank you. Some brief comments here around access control. Typical issues that we see is a lack of audit trail for approval for minimum necessary access to data. So, questions that we've had to deal with in the past is who approved this individual's access to this data, and how do you demonstrate that it's the minimum necessary for them to perform their job function. And so it's important for you to have an audit trail that says, this person was set up under these, for this job function. Here's the access that relates to this job function, and here's the approval audit trail of granting them access. The same is true from a documentation perspective for terminating access. So when you have turnover, it's important for you to be able to show, to demonstrate through documentation that you removed or restricted those accounts from any further access to PHI. Where we have a huge issue time and time again with many of our clients is access for students, temporary employees, students and contractors, sometimes volunteers. These folks are not necessarily showing up in the HR system. There's not a great audit trail of when they came in the organization, when they left the organization, and often these controls rely on managers in different departments to let somebody know in security or in IT that they've moved on. It's a huge exposure point, it's a huge weak point for many of our clients, and they do a pretty poor job at being able to keep up with it. Not easy to solve overnight, but I want to at least make you aware of this being a recurring issue time and time again. Can you move on, please? Thank you. So, and Anna mentioned this before. You're going to need to demonstrate. You're going to get this question because we know that OCR needs to build a list of business associates. So they're going to ask you, who are your business associates, and provide a list. And working with a number of clients, candidly, sometimes we get a list of 50 business associates for a health system, and of a similar health system, we'll get a list of 400. The correct probably number is somewhere in between. One is some organizations are signing business associates with every vendor, whether they touch PHI or not. And on the other end of the spectrum, and what's happening probably very frequently, is that organizations are struggling to keep up with the number of vendors that are accessing PHI, and they struggle to know who the organization, in a broader sense, has contracted with, and how those vendors are providing their services, and if those services are touching PHI. And so, particularly now with cloud services, and particularly now that IT doesn't have to necessarily be involved with all kinds of contracts where data is exchanged, it's becoming increasingly more difficult to keep tabs on who are your business associates and what kind of access they have to your environment, to PHI. So, a method that we've used in the past that we counsel our clients on is to pull accounts payable. Let's figure out who the heck we're paying, and that's usually a pretty darn good source of information around which vendors may be getting our data. One, we can probably lob some vendors off the list because we haven't paid them in 2 years, may or may not be using them. And on the other end of the spectrum, there's probably a whole number of vendors that are showing up that you're paying on a monthly basis, on an annual basis, that nobody was really accounting for from a business associate perspective. So, that's a strategy at least we've used to start trying to help our clients get our arms around who their business associates may be out there. And then, as Adam was mentioning before, make sure you have the contracts in place. Make sure that they're on the latest version, that they include the latest update requirements for the business associate agreement, and that you have those in place for any of your vendors that are providing you services and have access to PHI to those services. A quick mention here, and I want to make sure that we leave enough time for questions. Device and media controls, another focus area for OCR. particularly because more and more data is being accessed from portable devices. And there is significant concern around being able to control the data that is either accessed or stored on those devices. And so for many of our clients right now, they're really grappling with how do I make sure that we, at a minimum, encrypt these devices. So we're using USB drives or portable hard drives. How do we make sure that those devices are encrypted? And then when we allow access to our systems with mobile devices, smartphones, or iPads, or tablets, how do we make sure that we secure those devices as well? Sometimes we may get a somewhat ignorant response from a client that says, well, our folks just have access to email. They just use it for email. Well, having worked in health systems for a long time, I know that there's a lot of PHI exchange via email. There are a lot of attachments. There are a lot of Word documents that are included in emails, and unfortunately those emails can now be accessed via these devices, stored on those devices, maintained on those devices, and that presents a risk for our clients. So our clients are, one, encrypting portable media. They're putting in technologies to restrict any access, any USB plugged into a workstation or laptop that's unencrypted, and making sure that that encryption complies with their requirements. And then they're putting in security solutions to control and secure mobile devices. Pretty much the policy for many of our clients is if you want access to the company's data and information and IT resources using your personal device, you need to comply with our policies. And those policies are going to put a required password on your device. Those policies are going to enforce encryption on your device. Those policies may take even further controls, including being able to wipe your device. And that's just a risk mitigation policy that we have to implement if you're going to use your device to access our data. Next slide, please. So just to sum up, the objective for this presentation was to give you some background on where the status of the audits, and Adam is really probably one of the most well-informed individuals that you'll come across. He's, I think, helped you at least get the most current information that we have around the status of these audits. And then, just help you prepare. Again, we believe it's prudent to have a plan in place, to put some strategy in place for how you're going to respond, to identify who's going to be your point person, somebody that is well organized, that can project manage this for you, and can also understand the context and review documents as they come from your organization that need to be sent to the organizers, to the auditors. So we think with some planning and with some foresight, it doesn't have to be a painful process for you. And hopefully the auditors can come in, you can get them their documentation. There may be some feedback for you, but there's nothing really substantive that's going to cause a problem for you later on. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Lynn, who's going to spend a few minutes here with a quick demo, and then we're going to open up to questions. We love your questions, and look forward to getting from you.
Great, thank you. And again, if you do have questions, you can submit them on the Q&A section of your menu bar. But I'm going to take a quick 5 minutes and just talk about ComplyTrack and the different components of ComplyTrack that you can utilize to assist you in your HIPAA compliance endeavors. And what I have on the screen right now is our Information Security Assessment Manager. We saw in the presentation the importance of doing ongoing risk assessment related to HIPAA. And what our Information Security Assessment Manager is doing is giving you the ability to do IS risk assessments and having the ability within the system to customize your assessments. And it focuses beyond HIPAA security. HIPAA security does tend to be the biggest driver of this application, but being able to tailor your assessments in the system, to be able to work with the content that comes with it. Part of the presentation when they were talking about risk assessment was discussing the importance of being able to capture the threats and vulnerabilities specific to your organization, to be able to manage the likelihood and impact of these controls that you're assessing off of, to be able to create and manage corrective action plans. And these are all things that you can do within the system. So just quickly, you can see there's the ability to assign impact. The compliance score at the top of the screen is what functions as your likelihood. You can identify threats and vulnerabilities, which are to the right of the screen, in going through and conducting these assessments and then being able to work with an extensive amount of reporting, detailed text and data reports, heat maps, color-coded scorecard reporting, charts and graphs that you can utilize to be able to work with the responses and what you're doing with the responses and where you've identified issues and where you've addressed those issues, so that if you are dealing with one of these audits, that you have everything documented that you can be able to very easily present. So we have the Information Security Assessment Manager. We also have our Activity and Event Manager, which is a tracking tool. It's designed to assist organizations in tracking all of the things that you do and you deal with on a daily basis. So those can be issues or incidents, but they can also be things that you're doing proactively, education that you're conducting with staff, auditing and monitoring activities when meetings are being held. So within this application, for example, with what I have up on the screen, if there is a potential breach incident and you need to be able to manage all of the steps that you're taking in investigating it, in remediating it, that you can capture that in the system and attach all supporting documentation. So that could be the press release that had to be issued. It could be the letter that went to the affected individuals. It could be attaching your policies as appropriate or PowerPoints that you're utilizing in conducting education. This is an enterprise-wide tool. It goes beyond HIPAA, but a very big piece of this is being able to capture and manage all of your activity within the system. We have two other tracking tools. We have our Contract and Relationship Manager, which is going to give you the ability to be able to, for example, manage your business associates within the system. You can tie your business associate information to the contract itself. You could have separate entries set up for your business associate agreements, but being able to have this inventory within the contract manager that you're going to be able to come back to as necessary. I like to think of HIPAA as the gift that keeps on giving from a consulting and product perspective. You can count on change through the years. You can count on change as it relates to business associates and how those are defined potentially through the years. So having a good system in place within the contract manager to be able to identify your business associates and to be able to access your business associates agreements as they are necessary. And then also having a place to be able to manage your policies and procedures. So one of the things that really kind of was a common thread through the presentation was the importance of documentation and having a system in place to be able to maintain your policies and procedures for easy access as might be necessary. So that could be also templates. So you have your Notice of Privacy Practices template that you can come back to and you can revise as necessary. It can be all of your HIPAA policies that might need to change through the years, giving you a place to create them, to manage the approval process for them, and then to be able to maintain them over time, archiving older versions, updating them when it becomes necessary, and having the ability to go back to those archived documents if, say, an incident is identified and you have to see what was the policy we had in the place at the time of that incident. And tied together with the document manager can be our survey manager, which gives you the ability to create surveys on anything you want that you can send out to as many individuals as you might need to for response. So if you create a new HIPAA policy, you make a change to your HIPAA policy, and you need to make sure that your employee population is aware of the policy. You have the ability to attach documents or include links to documents within the surveys that you send out. And then you can include an attestation question, attest to the fact that you've received and read the document, holding individuals accountable for what you're sending to them. And you can send a survey out to anyone. So if you make a change to your HIPAA policy, you need to communicate it to your business associates. You could do that through the survey manager as well. So just a few examples of how you can utilize different components of ComplyTrack to assist you with your HIPAA activities. But at this point, I am going to turn the presentation back over to Beth to be able to go through any questions that we have in the time remaining.
Well, thank you to all of our wonderful speakers. And yes, we do have some really good questions today. Okay. Can you hear me?
Now we can.
All right, so thank you. We have some great questions. Will the audit's results be made public? Question 1.
So we have not heard, we don't expect that individualized audit results will be made public. They weren't for phase 1, and we haven't heard anything suggesting that they would for phase 2. What we saw for phase 1, and I would expect for phase 2, is aggregate results. Essentially, the slides that I presented towards the beginning were from OCR presentations based on phase 1 audits, and so I think we'll eventually see similar aggregate results published through presentations in all likelihood by OCR.
Thank you. Where there'll be penalties associated with the findings of the audits?
Very good question. We've gotten a little bit of back and forth on that. The original phase 1 audits, OCR made a big point, the Office for Civil Rights made a big point of saying that they were not looking to use this as a vehicle to seek settlements or penalties. With respect to phase 2, under the previous director, there was some mention of the idea that they really might push towards using this more for penalties. If you fail one of these phase 2 audits, there's a good chance that they would seek a formal enforcement, like a settlement, or worst case, a penalty. They've seemed to push back a little bit on that, so it's not as clear now that that's going to be the case for these phase 2 audits. So we've heard some talk, but not necessarily consistent talk of greater potential for penalties for or settlements under the phase 2 audits.
So what's your best guess when OCR will initiate phase 2 audits?
Oh, whatever my best guess is, it'll be wrong, but I wouldn't be surprised within the next 2 months or so to see the surveys finally go out, but we've been expecting that for a while. So they're continuing to work on some technical challenges of creating a sort of a audit portal that they will use, and I don't have information on whether that's truly ready at this point, but I do think that we're probably getting close to at least the surveys going out. So there's no requirement that policies have to get approved in a certain way. So I would say yes, an electronic process is fine as long as you've got some clear documentation of what's final and when. Cliff, is that your impression also? Might have lost Cliff there.
Hi, Adam. So, I'm here. Sorry, I'm coming off mute. Yeah, that's my impression as well. I think for many of our clients, some sort of electronic confirmation is sufficient, and at least either through the GRC capability, the document is signed off, or there's some email confirmation that the document is signed off. As long as there's an old trail of that information, I think that's what's critical.
Thank you. What is the requirement for frequency of HIPAA training recertification? Is it annual? What's the regulation code?
So the regulation just provides for periodic training. It doesn't specify a time period. It does expect training of new employees, and it does expect training of when there are material changes to the law, but it doesn't specify how frequently you need to retrain. I think a lot of people consider annual training a best practice, but there's not a clear requirement on that. I think what's most important is having a training program where you identify problems that you've seen and address those in training, rather than doing potentially the same HIPAA 101 and not addressing the issues specific to your organization. Cliff?
If an organization received a call to confirm address information, does that guarantee receipt of a survey?
not going to use the word guarantee, but the odds are not in your favor in the sense that from what I had initially seen, it seems like everyone who gets contact address confirmation will get a survey. Now, the fact that you get a survey does not mean that you're going to be chosen for audit. The survey is just for looking at demographic information, and some subset of those who receive a survey will get selected for audit. But I expect that most, if not everyone, whose address was confirmed will probably receive a survey.
How are BAs chosen to be audited? How much notice is given?
That's a very good question. I don't have a very good answer. I mean, all we really know is that they're going to select the, they're going to create a pool of business associates based on the information they obtained from the covered entities who are selected for audit. I expect that if you look at the survey, and a link was sent out in the chat, and is on one of the earlier slides, the survey does have a section with respect to collecting demographic information from business associates. So I would not be surprised if they send a survey to all the business associates to be able to ascertain, is this an IT-based business associate or not, for example. And then it's probably going to be random selection from there. Whether they're going to stratify and make sure to, for example, get some big business associates and some small business associates, that I have not heard. The only stratification I've clearly heard is that they're going to distinguish between IT and non-IT business associates. Okay,
we have time for one more. Does the breach need to be included on the accounting of disclosure log?
Depends on the breach. So you could have an impermissible use or you can have an impermissible disclosure. If it's an impermissible use, that would not have to be included on the accounting of disclosures. If it's an impermissible disclosure, then yes, you would need to include that on your accounting of disclosures, whether you ultimately determined that it was a breach and did breach notification, or alternatively, you could find that it was a low probability of compromise and not a reportable breach, but as an impermissible disclosure, you would still need to include it on your accounting of disclosures tracking.
And thank you so much, everyone, for the wonderful questions. I know we have a few more. We will try to get back to you as soon as possible after the webinar with them. We're running over time, and I really want to respect everyone's time. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Cliff. Thank you, Lynn. And thank you to our attendees. We look forward to our next webinar together. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Take care.